HT Smartcast.
You are listening to a Mint production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
Hello listeners, welcome to the latest episode of Why Not Mint Money. I'm your host, Jash Kriplani. Well, recently, AMFI disclosed its monthly rate of investor flows, and interestingly, Thematic sectoral funds got the maximum flows among the equity categories. But are these funds suitable for all investors? What are their use cases and when they should be avoided? Well, to talk on this and more, today I'm joined by Avinash Luthria, who's an early fee financial planner and a SEBI-registered investment advisor.
Welcome to Why Not Mint Money, a personal finance podcast where we help you understand basic money concepts and share strategies for you to build your wealth. So let's get started with your money journey.
Hi Avinash, welcome to the latest episode of Why Not Mint Money. Thanks for joining us today. We would like to connect with you on a particular mutual fund category called thematic funds. Last month we saw a lot of flows coming into this particular category. Any thoughts from your side why money has moved to this category in March?
I haven't tracked the flows, but I'm using the term thematic to mean thematic or sectoral. That's what I assume.
Right.
Because that's the SEBI definition of the category. Thematic is either thematic or sectoral.
Right.
And I haven't looked at the flows, but SEBI themselves have said that they are not happy with there being so many, like 200 thematic and sectoral funds. I mean, not said those words, but that's effectively what the SEBI chairperson said.
Right.
Because all this fragmentation of schemes leads to higher fees for customers.
Right.
So I think some of it is, as of today's regulations, those are still relevant.
Right.
And we can talk more about this. But I think going forward, the way SEBI is thinking of the fees,
right,
they are trying to fix this issue that of too many new schemes and NFOs getting launched with different themes and different sectors and all of that.
Right. Agreed. I take that point. But Avinash, if you can, dive deeper into, the risk return profile of such funds and, what kind of purpose these funds serve and, what kind of investors are these suitable for?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I can think of three good use cases or relatively good use cases. So let me just start with those. I know you're calling them pros, but I'll just call them use cases.
Sure.
One is because they all fall under the umbrella of thematic in some or sectoral in some sense.
Right.
The strong use case is if someone has a religious reason why they need to invest a certain way in terms of avoiding tobacco, alcohol, stocks, and various other such religious reasons.
Yeah.
There are some funds called ethical funds, etc., which, for example, one which tracks the Sharia index, which follow that approach to investing. So in case someone has a strong religious reason for doing it, that is one strong use case I can think of. The fees of these funds such products tend to be a little higher than low-cost passive index fund like the Nifty 50 index fund. But if a person has a strong religious reason, then that's a good enough reason, probably. The second use case is a weaker use case where if someone has personal preference for ESG investing, environmental, social governance, again, to some extent, not wanting tobacco, alcohol, stocks, often that's the kind of the stronger driver, you could say.
Yeah.
Then there are some ESG funds. I think this is a weak use case. I'm not that convinced by it. But in case someone has a very, very strong desire to do this, it could be a way to do it. And ESG funds are under the umbrella of thematic funds.
Right.
My thinking is, it's better to just save the fees on that, give that, say, a high net worth individual if he saves 0.5% on fees on a 10 crore portfolio, he'll save 5 lakhs a year, give that 5 lakhs to charity.
Right.
Use a Nifty index fund and give the 5 lakhs to charity.
Right.
But imagine if there's a person who's just very particular, I don't want to do it, then these ESG funds are a possibility.
Sure.
The third is not relevant to retail investors, but it's useful to know from a knowledge point of view that foreign institutional investors sometimes invest in things like bank ETF because certain foreign limits are capped. And this is the only way for them to do it. But not very relevant for domestic retail investors. It's just from a knowledge point of view. These are the only three, you could say, use cases I can think of. Maybe there are others which haven't struck me. but these are the only 3 good use cases I can think of.
So last is more like you're saying, because FIIs use banking ETF, as an instrument because of, their limits. Of course, therefore, banking gets a lot of liquidity in that sense. So that's something it's good to be aware of for investors, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So someone might go and see, why does, if this person is saying, sector funds are bad, thematic funds are bad, why are, so many institutional investors going and investing in bank ETFs?
Right.
So I'm just trying to explain that you have high AUMs in such high AUM in such ETFs,
right?
Because foreign investors are capped, for example, let's say at 74% in a sector, in a bank.
Right.
There's no way they can mimic, say, some index, or they have some reason to invest in Indian banking. Right. They're forced to do it through the bank ETF because that doesn't count for these foreign limits. So it's a special use case for a foreign investor, not relevant for normal people like you and me.
Right. Like, early on, you touched upon the point, that having too many thematic funds, or say not thematic ones, just having too many funds in your portfolio can create an issue, right? So what kind of issue can it really create in one's portfolio?
Yeah, so, in a sense, I'll use some of the SEBI chairperson's words, but I'll just put it in a more blunt way in my own words then.
Right.
So what happens, SEBI had certain regulations. SEBI currently also has certain regulations on fees. Yeah. And in the words of the SEBI chairperson herself, she said they had certain unintended consequences. The unintended consequence was, SEBI said, for small funds, you can charge a high fee from the customer. That means the mutual fund can charge a high fee. Right. And for bigger funds, bigger AUM, you have to charge a lower fee. Yeah. So, but because in thematic fund, you can launch, in sectoral thematic funds, you can launch, say, 200 schemes. Yeah. You have a good loophole to get around this problem. Or, effectively, SEBI's rules become irrelevant. So the SEBI chairperson has said that this was not the intended consequence of, this is an unintended consequence of this rule. Right. It has created, in her own words, perverse incentives and led to mis-selling. Right. So SEBI has said that they are going to change the cap on schemes and fix this problem essentially. Sure. But the crux of what it means for the individual investors as follows. One is, these schemes are often really directed at investors in what are called regular plans, what I would call commission plans of mutual funds. They're not really directed at people investing in direct plans, though people in direct plans also could get excited by them and invest in them. And the logic is as follows. Imagine, due to SEBI rules, schemes fees are capped at 1.5%. And a large distributor tells the fund house, I want a commission of 1.5% per annum. And the fees are 1.5%. That's the maximum fee SEBI is allowing. Then obviously there's no way they can give them all 1.5% as commission. So what the fund house will do is it'll create a new thematic fund. Yeah. It'll be small firstly, so it's allowed to have a higher fee. Right. It'll keep the direct plan fees extremely low, like 0.3%, 0.4%. And everything between the high fee and the 0.3% of direct plan is available to pay as commission. So commissions of 1.5% per annum, etc., can be paid. So that was actually what is happening and why there are these 200 thematic and sectoral funds. So one problem is, just leads to high fees and high commissions for more so regular plan investors. Okay. Direct plan investors tend to look at it and say, oh, it's so exciting, 0.3% fees, but that was just a side effect of trying to give a high commission. It landed up with the direct plan having a very low fee because of the rules of SEBI fees and the desire to pay a high commission. Right. Second is fragmentation, as you pointed out, is true, but that is definitely a problem. But I would say there's an even bigger problem, which is imagine a person who invested in a lot of thematic and sectoral funds. Right. It leads to unnecessary randomness in your portfolio. So imagine there were 3 friends. Yeah. I'm a big fan of passive index funds, but just for simplicity, imagine there were 3 friends. One invested in a large cap active fund, and other 2 invested in thematic funds. Right. Among the thematic fund, 2 of those friends, one got lucky. He earned 1% more than the guy who invested in the large cap fund. Right. Over say 30 years. Right. And the other friend turned out to be unlucky, and he earned 1% less than the guy in the large cap. Right. So much randomness comes in. If somebody may only pick, I think infrastructure is going to be good. I think housing is going to be good. I think technology is going to be good. And those guesses might turn out right or wrong. So the unlucky friend who landed up with just 1% per annum lower return. Imagine he had his entire net worth in such schemes.
Right.
landed up with a 26% lower net worth than the average friend, the guy who just put it in large cap.
Right.
Naturally, the guy who got lucky got 26% higher net worth.
Right.
That's fine, good to have 26% more, but having 26% less than the average is a very big problem. So it just adds too much randomness, and as you said, it adds a certain amount of clutter in the portfolio, which is unnecessary.
Right.
And then you keep changing, and then you pay taxes when you exit, etc.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, actually, I wanted to understand that point more in detail. How, managing such a wide portfolio across so many funds, how cumbersome it can be, tracking that as well. Right. And, Avinash, next thing I wanted to ask you, then what are the alternatives, if say thematic fund is, one category which has, admittedly has seen, good amount of interest, but, then what are the alternatives out there? Are there any alternatives? There are so many other categories, can those categories also be used by investors to, indirectly play some kind of themes by maybe watching the style of the fund or the fund manager's investment style? Any thoughts on this?
So I'll come back to passive index funds because that's what I like, but taking it one step at a time. Trying to figure out which sector is going to do well, or special situations, or business cycle, or all of that is anyway what the active fund manager is trying to do. Right. So it's to the extent that one is willing to, it's probably, I hate saying this, but it's probably better to trust the active fund manager on a diversified large cap portfolio rather than trying to, make your own guesses about these different sectors which are very narrow, which could result in more randomness in one's portfolio. Right. The best way to do it would be just a passive index fund like the Nifty 50 index fund. But just as a contrast, I'm saying at least the large cap active fund is less bad than the customer himself or herself trying to pick a few sectors that they think is going to be hot. No matter how sophisticated they think they are.
Right. And you said probably if the sector is narrow or the theme is narrow, then it might not work that well, arguably. But what about if the sectors or themes are actually wide themes, right? What about in those cases? We also have seen funds which have like a wider thematic play, which is more all encompassing. What about those situations?
Let's assume there is such a category. Still, effectively, the customer is paying a higher fee as on current regulations because it's a smaller fund than a, say, large cap fund. And broadly speaking, if it's broad enough, it's probably not going to be so radically different in its return performance. Maybe it could be different. I'm not denying that. For example, let's take something that's broad enough. Let's say, someone picks, services. Now, services is a very broad category theme. So you can pick lots of companies in services. Fine, but basically you will get something like large cap returns with plus or minus some good luck or bad luck how the theme performs. But with a slightly higher fee. So why, as on current regulations at least, in the future regulations, I think SEBI will prevent that. But
that is as long as the fund size is small, right? Which tends to be the case. But
yes, it would be. Typically, the fund size for a thematic fund, there are some thematic funds which are more than 5,000 crores in AUM. But still, that's much smaller than the large cap funds of the same fund house.
Right. Sure. Right. So, if you can, talk about, you were saying, you wanted to also talk about passives as an alternative. You spoke about active also. You can continue telling us more about the alternatives that are out there to also, use as not necessarily as a theme, but as an option out there, as an alternative, as you think, probably you think is better.
I think the key part, which, people miss is, yes, one could make a certain statement that, firstly, it's very hard, but even if one, could make a statement that a particular sector is going to do well, the stocks in that sector might already be pricing in that optimism. So it's different just knowing, or even if you have an insight that a particular sector is going to do well, like, in the COVID time, everybody said pharma will do well. Okay, yeah, maybe, fine, possible, don't know. But even then, the stocks are already pricing in that optimism. So it's not so easy to actually do these thematic and sectoral bets. So I'm using the word specifically passive index fund, then I mean effectively the Nifty 50 index fund as the most, as a dominant index fund of India.
Okay.
As a concept, index funds, I mean, just to understand the concept of an index fund, actually is probably easier to understand it as a Nifty 500.
Okay.
Which means essentially an index fund means something that takes all the companies listed in India.
Mhm.
And the Nifty 500 comes the closest to that. It covers roughly, say, 95% of the market capitalization, or most precisely the free float market capitalization of India, which is a technical term, but think of it as market capitalization.
Yeah.
So Nifty 500 covers, or the top 500 companies cover 95%. So that's the easiest way to think of index funds, as covering all companies in the country or in the world. In our case, it's only India. So it's all companies in India. It just so happens that for historical legacy reasons, it was not Nifty 500 but Nifty 50 that became the prevalent index fund of India. So, conceptually, Nifty 500 is easier to understand and captures the concept of an index fund better. But for historical reasons, Nifty 50 was the first index fund, and that became the dominant index fund, and it has a few other technical reasons why it's became dominant in the definition of the construction of it. And effectively, Nifty 50 covers about 2/3 of all market capitalization in India. So you can think of it as 2/3 of the value of all companies, which is not 95%, but it's pretty good.
Yeah.
So it's like an approximation. We're not getting 95%, we're getting 2/3, say 67%, but at a much lower fee than the Nifty 500 index funds.
Right.
When you take that benefit of the lower fees, because there's so much competition among fund houses for Nifty 50, the fees are 0.2% typically for an index fund and slightly lower for an ETF for some reason. That extra juice that you get on the lower fee is worth using a Nifty 50 index fund. One, because today's fees are lower, and two, because of the competition, it will keep the fees under check even in the future. So today's fees, we don't know tomorrow's fees.
Right.
By picking a category like Nifty 50 index fund, we also have the confidence that the fees in the future also will remain, somewhere fair, maybe not 0.2%, but somewhere in that ballpark.
Right.
So conceptually, Nifty 500 is the way to think of it. In practice, Nifty 50 is the dominant index fund, equity index fund of India, and actually the product that I would say all sophisticated equity investors in India should be using.
But what about, if as an investor, I want to play mid cap, small caps, those segments also, as a theme, as it were, how do I go about that? Because at least in mid and small caps, we have seen a lot more outperformance there compared to large caps.
Sure. I hear you. So let's just start with the starting point, which was, the S&P, Standard & Poor's S&P puts out a report every 6 months called SPIVA, S&P Indices versus Active Funds India report. So this is specific to India. What's unique and special about this report is it takes into account funds that perform badly and disappeared and got disappeared by getting merged into better performing funds. This is the only available report which covers this. All free public databases do not have this data. So even you and I, if we go look at a free public database, we will not get this information about a fund that did badly and hence disappeared by getting merged into another fund. And that shows that, large caps, 2/3 of large cap funds underperform the index, 1/3 of large cap funds outperform the index. That same data looks a little less bad for mid cap and small cap funds as one category.
Right.
However, I have argued that is more of a statistical aberration. So what happened was there were not enough data points in mid and small cap. So S&P was forced to combine mid and small cap funds into one category, though they're actually two different categories. You need a certain number of data points to make sensible statements. They could not get that many data points of funds. So they forced to combine small and mid cap into one category. That created certain distortion in the data. Whatever, so be it. It resulted in a situation where, let's say, I'm just giving an example. Let's say half the mid and small cap funds beat the index and half did not. Let's just say, for example.
Right.
But yeah, half beat, half did not beat. It's like a coin toss. I mean, okay, large cap 2/3 failed to beat, 1/3 did beat. Here, half beat and half did not beat. What's the point? Okay, so then you may say, okay, fine. Why not just have exposure to small cap and mid cap, even if it's not through an active fund. So there my argument is that if you rewind to 2008-9, large cap equity, so Nifty 50, Nifty 100, whatever you may call it, fell by 59%.
Right.
Mid cap fell by 74% and small cap fell by 76%.
Right.
So imagine a 10 crore portfolio, for example, fell a large cap portfolio entirely in, a 10 crore portfolio entirely in large cap fell from 10 crores to 4.1 crores. And a mid cap portfolio fell to 2.6 crores. When you look at these numbers, they're staggeringly different. I mean, imagine you had 10 crores, suddenly now you have 4.1 crores versus 2.6.
Right.
4.1 is terrible, but 2.6 is even more terrible.
Right.
So the point being that there's really a limit to how much we can put into mid cap and small cap. These are actually, when you look at the market cap of India, they're very tiny categories. You could say they're probably something like mid and small cap is something like 20-25% of the market cap.
Right.
And most of that is mid. Small is even smaller than a very tiny portion.
Right.
So when already large cap is such a scary category, more so in any developing country, because then why complicate how much can we put into mid and small cap? Why complicate our life by doing it?
Right.
If you're choosing to do it, you could do it through a Nifty 500 fund, or there are even mid cap and small cap index funds. If you're someone is determined to do it, they could take a tiny portion of their portfolio and put it into a.
Sure.
If they want to put an active fund, so be it.
Right.
As long as it's just tiny play money where they're just playing around with it.
Right.
And it won't change their future too much.
Right. Thanks, Avinash. I think that, debate on active versus passive, large cap, mid cap, small cap, that will continue. And, I'm sure, probably we'd have to do a different episode altogether dedicated just to this topic. But, thanks, Avinash, for joining us today, especially on thematic funds and, what it means for investors, what are, like you said, use cases and what are probably not such good use cases and where they should be avoided as you shared your own assessment of it. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. If you liked this episode and would like to hear more such interesting conversations, do log into our channel Why Not Mint Money on Spotify, where you'd always find me omnipresent. Also, if you have any new ideas or suggestions, you can DM me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Jash Kriplani, that is JASHKRIPLANI. You can always reach out to us over the email. Our email ID is mintmoney@livemint.com.
This was a Mint production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.